Please don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more English story. I've always been the kind of person who believed that if I just worked harder, pushed myself further, and sacrificed more, I could outrun the things that haunted me. For years, I thought that was strength. I thought it was the only way to prove I was worthy of love, of success, of happiness. But what I didn't realize was that I was running on fumes, fueled by a toxic kind of motivation that left me empty, broken, and questioning everything about myself. This is the story of how I learned to stop running, how I learned to forgive myself, and how I finally understood that so much of what I carried wasn't my fault. The weight of enough. It started small, as these things often do, in school. I was the kid who stayed up late to finish assignments, not because I needed to, but because I wanted them to be perfect. I thought if I could just get straight A's, if I could just be the best, then maybe I'd feel like I belonged. Maybe I'd feel like I was enough. But enough is a moving target. No matter how much I achieved, it never felt like it counted. I'd get the grade, the praise, the recognition, and for a moment, I'd feel a flicker of pride. But then it would fade, replaced by this gnawing voice in my head. You could have done better. You should have done more. I carried that voice with me into adulthood. It followed me to work, to relationships, to every corner of my life. I thought if I could just outwork it, outsmart it, outlast it, I'd finally silence it. But the harder I pushed, the louder it got. The breaking point. There was a moment, a specific, gut-wrenching moment, when I realized I couldn't keep going like this. I was sitting in my car, parked outside my apartment. After another 14-hour day at work, I was exhausted, but I couldn't bring myself to go inside. I just sat there, staring at the steering wheel, feeling like I was drowning in a sea of my own expectations. I remember thinking, what's wrong with me? Why can't I just be happy? Why can't I just feel like I'm enough? And then, out of nowhere, I started crying. Not the kind of crying where a few tears slip out and you quickly wipe them away. This was ugly, heaving, can't catch your breath crying. The kind that comes from somewhere deep inside, from a place you didn't even know existed. I sat there for what felt like hours, crying until I had nothing left. And when I finally went inside, I looked in the mirror and didn't recognize the person staring back at me. The turning point. That night was the beginning of something I didn't fully understand at the time. It was the first crack in the armor I'd built around myself. The first hint that maybe the way I'd been living wasn't sustainable. I started therapy a few weeks later. I'll be honest, I didn't want to go. I thought therapy was for people who couldn't handle their problems on their own. And I'd always handled everything on my own. But I was desperate, and I didn't know where else to turn. My therapist's name was Sarah. She had this calm, steady presence that made it impossible not to open up. At first, I tried to keep things surface level. I talked about work stress, about how I never felt like I was doing enough. But Sarah saw through that. She asked questions that cut straight to the heart of things. Questions I didn't want to answer. Where do you think this need to prove yourself comes from? She asked one session. I shrugged. I don't know. I guess I just want to be successful. But why? She pressed. What happens if you're not? I didn't have an answer. Or maybe I did, but I wasn't ready to say it out loud. Unpacking the baggage. Over time, Sarah helped me unpack the baggage I've been carrying for years. We talked about my childhood, about the messages I'd internalized about worth and achievement. We talked about the times I'd felt overlooked or dismissed, and how I'd learned to equate being seen with being loved. It was painful, digging through all of that. There were moments when I wanted to shut down, to retreat back into the safety of my armor. But Sarah kept gently pushing me to stay with it, to feel the things I'd been avoiding for so long. One session, she said something that stopped me in my tracks. You know, it's not your fault. She said, "Istir daher." What's not my fault? The way you feel, the way you've been carrying this weight. It's not your fault. I didn't know how to respond. Part of me wanted to argue, to say that, of course, it was my fault. If I were stronger, smarter, better, I wouldn't feel this way. But another part of me felt this strange sense of relief. Like a knot in my chest was starting to loosen. The power of forgiveness. As the weeks went on, I started to understand what Sarah meant. The toxic motivation I'd been running on wasn't something I'd chosen. It was something I'd learned, something I'd absorbed from the world around me. And while I couldn't change the past, I could choose how I moved forward. I started to practice self-compassion, something that felt foreign and uncomfortable at first. I'd spent so much of my life beating myself up for every mistake, every failure, that the idea of being kind to myself felt almost wrong. But Sarah encouraged me to treat myself the way I would treat a close friend. It wasn't easy. There were days when I slipped back into old patterns, when a voice in my head told me I wasn't doing enough. But slowly, I started to notice a shift. I began to recognize that voice for what it was, a product of my past, not a reflection of my worth. Finding genuine inspiration. One of the most surprising things about this journey has been discovering what genuine inspiration feels like. For so long, I thought motivation had to come from a place of fear or pressure. But I've learned that real inspiration is softer, quieter. It comes from a place of love, not fear. I've started to pursue things that bring me joy, not because they'll make me look good or prove something to someone else, but because they light me up inside. I've reconnected with old hobbies, like painting and writing, that I'd abandoned because I didn't think they were productive enough. And I've started to set boundaries, to say no to things that drain me and yes to things that nourish me. It's not perfect. There's still days when I struggle, when the old voices creep back in. But now I have tools to deal with them. I remind myself that it's not my fault, that I'm doing the best I can, and that's enough. A message to you, if you're reading this. If any part of my story resonates with you, I want you to know this. It's not your fault. The weight you're carrying, the voices in your head, the feeling that you're not enough, it's not your fault. You didn't choose to feel this way. You didn't choose the circumstances that shaped you. But you can choose how you move forward. You can choose to be kind to yourself, to forgive yourself, to believe that you are enough, exactly as you are. It won't happen overnight. It's a journey. And like any journey, it has its ups and downs. But you don't have to do it alone. Reach out to someone you trust, a friend, a therapist, a mentor. Let them walk beside you. And remember, you are not defined by your struggles. You are not defined by your past. You are so much more than the weight you carry. It's not your fault. And you are enough. This is my story, but it's also yours. Because we're all fighting battles, carrying weights, trying to find our way in this messy, beautiful world. And if there's one thing I've learned, it's that we're stronger together. So let's keep going. Let's keep growing. And let's keep reminding each other, it's not your fault. You are enough. Always. Moral of the story. The moral of this story is that self-compassion and forgiveness are not signs of weakness, but acts of profound strength. We often carry burdens that were never ours to bear, shaped by external expectations, past experiences, and societal pressures. But the truth is, it's not your fault. You are not defined by your struggles, your mistakes, or the voices in your head that tell you you're not enough. Real growth begins when we stop running from ourselves and start embracing who we are, flaws and all. Genuine inspiration comes from love, not fear. And it's okay to seek joy. Set boundaries and prioritize your well-being. You are enough, just as you are, and your worth is not something you have to prove. Part 2. The journey forward. The night I sat in my car, crying until I had nothing left, was the beginning of a journey I didn't know I needed. But it wasn't the end. In fact, it was just the start of learning how to live, not just survive, but truly live. Learning to let go. One of the hardest lessons I've had to learn is that letting go doesn't mean giving up. It doesn't mean you're weak or that you've failed. Letting go is about releasing the things that no longer serve you, the toxic expectations, the impossible standards, the belief that you have to earn your worth. For me, letting go looked like quitting a job that was draining the life out of me. It looked like ending relationships where I felt small and unseen. It looked like forgiving myself for the times I fell short, for the mistakes I made, for the person I used to be. Letting go isn't a one-time event. It's a practice. Some days, it feels like second nature. Other days, it feels like trying to hold water in my hands. But every time I choose to release something that's weighing me down, I feel a little lighter, a little freer, building a new foundation. When you spent your whole life building your identity on shaky ground, on achievements, on other people's opinions, On the need to be perfect, it's terrifying to start over. But that's exactly what I had to do. I started by redefining what success meant to me. It wasn't about titles or accolades or external validation. It was about feeling at peace with myself, about doing work that mattered to me, about being present in my own life. I also had to learn how to trust myself. For so long, I'd relied on external cues to tell me if I was on the right track, if I was doing enough, if I was good enough. But I realized that no one else could give me the answers I was looking for. I had to learn to listen to my own voice, to trust my own instincts. The power of community. I used to think I had to do everything on my own. Asking for help felt like admitting defeat. But one of the most beautiful things about this journey has been realizing that I don't have to do it alone. I've found so much strength in the people around me, my therapist, my friends, my family. They've been my cheerleaders, my sounding boards, my safe spaces. They've reminded me of my worth when I couldn't see it myself. And I've also found strength in strangers, in the stories they've shared, in the ways they've shown up for themselves and for others. It's reminded me that we're all in this together, that none of us are as alone as we sometimes feel. Embracing imperfection. One of the most freeing things I've learned is that it's okay to be imperfect. It's okay to make mistakes, to have bad days, to not have it all figured out. Perfection is an illusion, and chasing it will only leave you exhausted and empty. Instead, I've learned to embrace the messiness of life, to celebrate the small wins, like getting out of bed on a hard day or saying no to something that doesn't align with my values, to find beauty in the imperfect, in the real, in the raw, a new kind of motivation. The motivation I have now is different from the kind I used to run on. It's not fueled by fear or pressure or the need to prove myself. It's fueled by love for myself, for the people around me, for the life I'm building. It's the kind of motivation that allows me to take risks, to try new things, to fail without falling apart. It's the kind of motivation that reminds me that I'm enough, just as I am, and that I don't have to earn my place in this world. A message to you, again, if you're still here, if you've made it this far, I want to say this. You're not alone. Whatever you're carrying, whatever you're struggling with, you don't have to do it alone. It's not your fault. And it's not your burden to carry forever. You're allowed to let go. You're allowed to start over. You are allowed to be imperfect, to be human, to be you. And you are enough. Not because of what you've achieved or what you've overcome, but simply because you exist. This journey isn't easy, but it's worth it. Because on the other side of the pain, the fear, the self-doubt, there's a life waiting for you, a life that's full of love, of joy, of possibility. So keep going, keep growing. And remember, it's not your fault. You are enough, always. This is the end of my story, but it's also the beginning of yours. And I hope, more than anything,